Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the role that the big international consulting firms play in the Globalist project. They're absolutely central, if not pivotal, to the Globalist project. Now, we're talking multi-billion-dollar concerns that have consultancies and advisory operations across the entire Western world, and they are in receipt of huge government contracts worth billions upon gazillions. So they're rivers of taxpayer money just come in the front door of these consulting firms, and they advise governments on everything from social policy to tax policy to propaganda policy, everything, how to run elections, how to rig elections, everything is their advisories are, and they also play a very critical role in bringing, in mass migration, in bringing out lots of black and brown peasants to the West under spurious type situations where they say there's a shortage of particular skills or something like that, but it's all a fucking charade in my opinion, at least. Now I've noticed sort of over a period of years, I guess, but it seems to have ramped up recently, where the big consulting houses are really, government is outsourcing policy development, a whole range of things, tax policy, social policy, housing policy, you fucking name it. Governments are outsourcing the heavy lifting on policy to these big consulting firms. Now, the consulting firm, what quality of their quality of consulting, I'd question, but effectively this has turned the big consulting firms into massive patronage machines. So the government is saying, well, we'll give you all this taxpayer money, gazillions of dollars, but you have to agree to hire our friends, our relatives, our flunkies, our stooges, people we owe favors to, black lesbians and the whole thing. You have to hire all these people in the right. So firstly, individuals who we owe things to or want to have hired. And we want you to pay them big money, not pittance. They're not going to get chump change. We want serious money for our friends. So these consulting firms are fielding endless calls, and they have highly paid liaison officers, endless calls from politicians to say, I want you to employ my buddy on $650,000 a year plus benefits. And the patronage machine runs wide. For example, someone who's a friend of government is getting divorced, and they're going to have to pay serious bucks in child support, $20,000 with alimony, $25,000 a month, $30,000 a month. They go, holy shit, that's a lot. So what they'll do is they'll cut a deal with their ex-wife and say, look, I'll give you a job on I'll fix a job up for you, a do nothing job. You don't turn up or do anything. You're just on the payroll, and it'll be a $250,000 a year job plus overseas trips. And you get a car and other benefits. You're going to get invited to all these new product launches of women's clothing and cosmetics. You'll be running around the party circuit, and you'll have a special allowance for brand label clothes at the clothing boutiques. And so, but we'll give you all this, but just I don't have to pay your child support. Oh, okay, she says, that sounds good. So all these sorts of deals are being done for friends and relatives and friends of governments and friends of influential people. So it's a massive patronage machine. But I wasn't aware of just how many levels, until recently, how many levels these companies are operating on. Not only are they doing this supposed heavy lifting on policy development. Now, if you look at the sort of policy development papers that they bring out and have, they're quite well produced. The production quality is high. Some of the graphics are quite good as well. But what about the policies? They don't seem to have been written by policy experts. Maybe the addendum has been looked at by lawyers. So maybe you could say there's some value adds going on there. But I think any first year uni student could write a lot of that policy for them. So we're not talking high quality work. What we're talking about is really an excuse to just move money around. And if the whole thing falls over, the government says, well, it wasn't us, they did it. We only did what they said. They're the experts. We just did what they said. And this is very much the round robin of blame and responsibility that is quite commonplace all across the Western world today. So they've got a former politician as a liaison officer at one of the and multiple one. I'm just looking at one here, and his base salary is $1 million a year to act as a liaison, so that political people, government people call up, say, I want my buddy employed, I want my daughter employed, I want my son given a job, I want my mistress employed. That's his fucking job. To he's paid $1 million a year just to operate an element of this huge patronage machine, which is just recycling taxpayer dollars back into the pockets of the politicians, their buddies. Similarly, if you look at ex-politicians, how many of them are employed again on $1 million type salaries at these consulting firms, and they're employed effectively as kind of lobbyists, I suppose you'd say. So that really the government or the body politic can go to these big consulting firms and say, we're going to third party out all the lobbying to you, and then you can pay these people, and we'll give you the taxpayer dollars from the taxpayer to pay these fucking lobbyists. And so they just resell, and then they sell that lobbying service to the private sector. But effectively, it's almost a monopoly, for goodness sakes, racket. Racket. Let's call it what it is, a racket. Now, on top of that, they have think tanks, if you like, and special other outside consulting firms that in turn the big consulting firms subcontract to. But these are just front organisations, and these are organisations that would release stories to the media saying that evil racism is everywhere, and that the only way that the economy can be rich is if illiterate brown peasants from the third world can come out and do something or other. They're the ones that say that really they aren't illiterate brown peasants or black peasants. They're not at all. They're all rocket scientists. So there's this massive propaganda machine, through this distributed network of front organisations that are supposedly are expert consulting groups on their own, and they then distribute this propaganda in concert with the globalist controlled media. So there's a huge media machine operating as well, to influence people and influence points of view. They also employ community engagement departments, so that if the government says, well, we want to push more black lesbians in I don't know, this or that occupation, then these people will be fan out across social media, putting information out there and feeding back on what the response is from the public and so on. But their job is to persuade the public through getting changing minds or adjusting attitudes or influencing attitudes to accept mass migration or to applaud it or to uphold it and so on. Now, on top of that, they've got departments in there that their job is to bring black and brown peasants over to the West. So they have these sort of scams running where there'll be a department full of black activists who've been pulled out of Africa to work in, for example, Australia, and their job is to liaise with the NGOs and the people that operate these refugee camps in Africa, or people who say teachers that are sent from and they're using various grants. And again, this is a scam and a racket. They'll an NGO will say, or the United Nations will put up X amount of millions to send teachers to go out into rural Africa, but these teachers aren't being sent to teach. They're being sent to push Marxist theory and feminist theory and trans theory, to tell boys they're all bad and they're all fascists and so on. So they're there to socially engineer the African rural population, particularly the men, and to encourage the women to be assertive and take control. And then they'll set up businesses in these third world dirt poor countries that they subsidise, businesses that wouldn't stand up for 1 second on their own, but they'll only give the money to women to have these businesses because it redresses gender imbalance or something like that, they'll say. Anyway, they liaise, so there's a liaison department inside this one of these big consultancies that liaises with all these activists, all these NGOs, refugee camp operators on targeting and finding people to bring out to Australia, and then they'll have these bullshit scam courses inside the refugee camp. The refugees may or may not be genuine, that's immaterial to them, but they'll do these bullshit courses in I don't know, marketing or something, and then they'll say this is a person who's qualified in marketing, and they'll have this fake certificate that she speaks English, and then they'll sponsor her as a migrant and bring her out. I mean, she's got no skills, she's never worked, can barely speak a lick of English, but they're bringing her out under false. So there's all these immigration scams going on as well. But they're, the globalist controlled Western governments are very much part of this as well. They tolerate it, encourage it, promote it, assist it, aid it, abet it. And so these sort of things are going on. Now, if you look at all the big consulting firms, I 6 or 7, I suppose, are the really big ones internationally, and they're all feeding, their snouts are so far in the taxpayer-funded trough that they're snorkeling, for goodness sakes, they couldn't get out. So they're receiving all these rivers of money, really for nothing other than to provide services for globalization, to deliver services for the globalization project. And they're paid quite handsomely to do it. As I've said many times before, people who do in the West now, people who do productive work are not paid very well. But people who are enabling and assisting and furthering the globalist project are, by comparison, paid well. Some of the NGO jobs now, 2 or 3 days a week, they're being paid, $200,000 a year. Diversity, equity, inclusion officers getting paid $500,000 a year. So we're looking at most of the. If I just a couple of days ago, I went onto one of the biggest job boards internet online job boards in Australia, and I do this every now and again, and I have a look at all the diversity, equity, inclusion type jobs and what they pay, the salary range, and then what engineering jobs are paying, the guys who are building the bridges and the roads, and with rare exception, the diversity, equity, inclusion type jobs pay far better than the engineering jobs. So, an engineer in charge of a multi-billion-dollar project is often paid half what a director of diversity, equity, and inclusion is at some fucking university. So, so this gives you an idea of how things are and the big role, the major role that these big consulting firms are playing. The trouble is when you move away from merit and you move away from what's needed or any independent objective measurement, as soon as you move away from that, it automatically slides into corruption and patronage and kickbacks and sleazy under the table payments like I used to see all over the third world. Those sort of things now that I'd rarely see in Australia. They were around, but you'd rarely see it in the third world. You saw nothing but that. And that's why they were poor and the West was rich. But now, increasingly, the West is sliding into this sort of corruption and patronage and sleazy payments. And it's sapping, it's bleeding the wealth away from the Western economy. It's doing it quite quickly. You've been Tassos today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.